Hello and welcome to this Marketing and Communications Watch webcast brought to you by the Conference Board. In this installment of our series on brand and business building during the COVID-19 crisis, we will talk about forecasting packaged goods demand and managing its supply. If you work in CPG, as it's called, or have been in any grocery stores or even on Amazon recently, you know exactly what we will talk about. My name is JP Kuhlwein. I'm principal at Überbrand Consulting, adjunct professor of marketing at Columbia University, and most important in this context here, the leader of the Marketing Institute here at the Conference Board. Welcome, everyone. A couple of housekeeping items before we go. You can get continuing education or CP credits. Somebody could show that slide for joining us today. If you type in your full name and email address, that is, just click OK. There are pop-ups and so on. You sign your life away and you'll get those credits. And please ask a lot of questions and click on those pop-ups during the program to make sure you're actually awake. We need to verify that. And asking questions applies to everyone, and I'm sure you'll have some. That is because today it's my particular pleasure to welcome James Richardson to this show. Hello, James.
Hello, JP.
James is the founder of Premium Growth Solutions, or PGS. And he's joining us virtually today. But before getting into business consulting, James did his PhD in cultural anthropology and spent some adventurous years in a field study in South India. I hope we'll get to talk about that at least a little bit because he had kind of a little crisis of his own down there. And I hope he will tell us how that relates and maybe helps him actually in having become an eminent expert when it comes to consumer packaged goods, particularly in the food sector, particularly as it relates to innovation, building demand, and thus forecasting also demand and managing the supply chain. He says that big corporations taught him a lot about how to grow in the CPG sector, but he also thinks that they shouldn't have a monopoly on it. So hence his declared goal is to democratize access to the best practices about brand growth, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. And in this coronavirus crisis, CPG marketers certainly are wondering, am I going to grow? What am I going to do? Or others are wondering about how to stoke that growth that they're certainly seeing even more. It just depends on which category you're in, and we're going to discuss that as well. So with that, thank you again, James, for joining us. Where are you joining us from?
Thanks, JP, for having me. I'm in downtown Seattle in an apartment.
Looks like we're having a delay there.
Hi, JP. I'm still here. I'm in Seattle. I turned off my webcam, JP. Can you guys hear me?
I am not sure, Luke, if we are stuck
I can
here
hear you
with
fine,
the video,
JP.
or if James cannot hear us.
Whoop.
All right, it looks like we've lost him. So maybe I should bridge this actually by already telling you
JP, I'm still here.
what I'm supposed to tell you at the very end of the webcast, which is about other events while we're trying to reestablish the connection with James. Let me try and pull up those slides.
Okay.
Oh, you're still there. Okay,
right.
I cannot see you. Okay, well then, James, before we go into CPG and COVID, demand and supply, I want to come back to you being an anthropologist Um, how did you get from doing studies in
It was
South
a torturous
India
journey, and
to
I won't drag
studying
the listeners through
CPG
it.
strategy? And does the
I
social
left
science background
academia
help you?
willingly because I was no longer satisfied. I wound my way into market research, which is sort of how I morphed into the business world. That's what I'll say briefly. But what culture anthropology was particularly useful for in the business arena, especially in CPG, is paying deep attention to context in which you're doing business and the nuances of that context, and specifically the gap between stated aspiration and what actually is habitualized behavior. And you only make money in CPG on habit. You don't make money, on flippant aspirations. So in that sense, it very helpful background to have as a marketer. You can get that kind of background from other degrees as well.
Right, right. I mean, behaviors, the actual outcomes are the only measure of true success. Theory doesn't pay the bills, I guess. Even forecasts don't pay the bills. Um, Now, when we look, though, at trying to understand and maybe even predict what's going to happen out there as far as the COVID crisis is concerned, you like to use the word and the images of a tsunami, and we have
the reason I think the metaphor is apt is that a tsunami
what reminds
we
you
become
of a
aware of a
tsunami when
tsunami
we talk about this crisis?
when this giant wave crests and hits the shore, right? And unfortunately, the world went through that in 2004, sorry, in Southeast Asia. So that's what we notice, right? Because it's this big, dramatic media event. And we certainly went through that for 2 weeks in March. And then what happens is that initial crest dies very quickly, and we're left with an elevated surge. And that's really what a tsunami is. It's essentially an elevated surge of water that just keeps flowing for quite a while, actually. And then at some point it dies down again. So the structure of the curve is actually very similar to that. And I think the challenge is that it's super easy because of that giant initial wave, which is violent. In this case, violent on the retail environment, but also in the way back to the supply, to the far origin of the supply chain. People tend to overreact at the front end of the value chain, and that can be a mistake. Right? So luckily, we now have. I was able to get through 6 weeks of weekly, year-over-year data to see the structure of the trend thanks to IRI and BCG getting this out there. And when you map it out, this is the curve that you see right here on the slide. Just to be clear, this is consolidated food and beverage year-over-year weekly growth for the top 30 or so staple food and beverage categories, which drive probably 40 to 50% of the dollar sales or more. So and all the profit. So for those of you in banking. So this is where the profit is. It's in this tsunami right here. So you see that you had really an unprecedented surge to 50% above the prior year's weekly sales rate, but that only lasted for 2 weeks. It felt like 2 years, I think, to folks stocking the shelves, but it was really only 2 weeks. And then it plummeted about 70% the next week on average. But here's the thing. I'm showing you an aggregate curve, and I guess this is where my background, JP, hurts or it helps. You can decide. But I hate these aggregate curves. And I think when we go to the media, we see them all the time. And they're helpful in one sense to look at a crude phenomenon that's going on. But as a business person, this curve doesn't really matter to you. What matters to you is what's going on in your category. And as we're about to see, there's a massive amount of variation. And that variation is explainable based on yeah. Go ahead.
Right, right, right. And I alluded to this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I alluded to this in the intro. There seems to be, at least if you go to the supermarket or you listen to the media, there seems to be clear winners and losers when we look at it from a product or a category or company level. Like everyone says, toilet paper through the roof, King Arthur flour sold out. But we don't hear that about Kale Coke, and then Zoom and Amazon through the roof, including their shares. But Airbnb or Delta Airlines
my best guess at this
struggling.
point, and
when you look at
none of us have really been through this, but my best
specifically,
guess as a
who
social
are the
scientist
winners
is
and
that
losers?
you're
How do you
dealing with
forecast that? How can you understand that?
two major variables. One is a classic marketing variable, and that has to do with the purchase cycle of the brand, and which is structured culturally and also structured by retailers. And the other one is the occasion structure of the category, and that is, that's something it's become, I think, pretty normative in soda companies and beverage companies to do occasion-based demand planning. Not as common in the food end of the CPG sector. I'm not as aware in personal care at P&G and how much they do that. But I think, when you're dealing with categories that have very complex occasion structures, and the split that I would focus listeners on is away from home, at home. It's super crude, and you can make it more complicated for marketing purposes, but that's the major behavioral split. So those two, where the products are being consumed is category specific. That balance of away from home and home in terms of the revenue is always category specific, and the variation's extreme in some categories. Like energy drinks is, it's insane how much, it's over 50% is purchased and consumed out of the home. So energy drinks have collapsed. It's disaster for those categories. Then you've got other categories like diet soda, they've lost food service revenue. That's a problem. But on the retail package side, they're doing okay because, they have a whole system and a whole price pack architecture that allows you to just go buy cases and cases and bring it home. And people are used to doing that. So they've been able to soften the blow. In terms of the slide you're seeing here, what I find, what is clear from the last recession in terms of who won when people got unemployed, and when people get unemployed, they stay at home more, right? So that was like a mini version of the government stay at home more, is be laid off, right? You're going to be at home more. What we found was that packaged food and beverage did really, really well. They got a surge at home that was incremental to their base business for a while. But the people who won were the 9 and 10-figure legacy brands. Those are the people who captured most of the extra sales. When we get into the early stage, and that's where I focus a lot of my time with clients, is the early stage up to $100 million in trailing revenue. Some of the lower household penetration and early stage brands are able to pick up and benefit here based on the category, but they need to have kind of outsized awareness, like Spindrift or Topo Chico, which has an unbelievable word of mouth, for them to really benefit. Because the problem is behaviorally when people, at least what I'm seeing, is that people are shopping more of in an in and out style. And so there's less browsing. When there's less browsing in any channel, they're not going to notice those end caps, those promotional displays. There's definitely less trial of new things. How much less is very hard to measure, but we know there's going to be less because people just aren't looking. Where you get trial, and people have studied this, where you tend to get trial that's unexpected is in very well-known, smaller market share brands.
Gotcha.
Yes, yeah. I call them zombie brands.
Just as a remark, a lot of these
zombie brands that weren't doing that well before, don't have a lot of market share, they may actually get a resurgence
by larger groups
because they're better in stock. So you get this sort of, well, it's here. I'll have, I'll have SpaghettiOs or whatever. So those guys tend to get a lift. I don't know if it's sustainable, but it's sustainable.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, what's ironic to me, JP, is that some of the companies that were organic volume-based growth, the big companies like ConAgra and Kraft,
portfolio might
before this,
help a little bit.
They were struggling because their portfolio was not oriented enough, balanced enough to out-of-home and impulse out-of-home consumption, like a beverage company, right? And you can't hold Kraft Heinz to the standard of Pepsi. That makes no sense. But the point is, there are food companies that have a better snack portfolio and a better out-of-home exposure. And before COVID, that was extremely smart. It's turning out to be a massive liability right now. So the guys that were doing the worst on organic unit volume growth are actually surging right now and having a great time. But, you know, the problem is that will all come to an end for them. That surge, that elevated sales will decline. It's just a matter of how fast and when. The minute people get reemployed, back out consuming, and I fully expect Americans to eventually get back to the same rate of out-of-home consumption. So one of the things that
Now, you prepared a slide here that reminds us of some key variables that you need to understand and take into account when you forecast, which is the product cycle, the usage, etc., consumption rates, and so on.
So
can you help us through these a little bit? How do you use these variables to better understand
when you're
the
looking
height
at
of the
specific
wave,
categories, or if you're looking at
the frequency of the
company's
wave,
portfolio and the category
what
mix
you
that
can
they're in?
expect?
You know, you want to look at the purchase cycle of that category, which is part cultural and part a creation of the manufacturer. And you want to look at, and that consumption, I'll be honest, the purchase cycle in my experience is very, very, very hard to change. It's quickly. I mean, you can change it over 10 years in a category through brand building, but it's very hard to change very quickly. Consumption rate, however, is much easier to change quickly if you know how to do brand building. The problem is that it's much easier to change the consumption rate at the brand level if you're building a new business around that new behavior. And you know, this is what Crave Jerky did, for example. They took a tired impulse category that was growing, but its dynamics were not changing, and they sort of messed with the consumption rate by bringing it into the supermarket channel. And they turned it into a multi-week snack for a totally different audience. So, you know, that is something you can do when you're building a new business. But consumption rate and purchase cycle, there's a cultural inertia to those two that you want to understand what they are before you start making guesses about what's going to happen. But basically, what's going on is that, and you'll see an example shortly, that the longer purchase cycle categories, a bunch of them get overstocked, but the consumption rate is inelastic. In other words, it doesn't, you know, if I ship you a truckload of toilet paper, you will not consume toilet paper any faster. But I guarantee you that if you're a Pepsi fan and I gave you a half truckload of Pepsi, I guarantee you if I stuffed it in your house, you would double to triple the rate of Pepsi consumption almost immediately. If you like Pepsi. That's the difference between soft drinks and basically boring commodity paper goods. So if you have a company, that is, go ahead.
I was surprised though. I'll tell you an anecdote. I mean, I talked to my former colleagues at P&G, and I was talking about, grooming probably going further down because people, men, shave even less. And coming out of the crisis, that habit might remain, so that's a true habit hit. And then I was wondering aloud about categories like hair care, toothpaste, etc. And surprisingly, they said early indicators are people shower more often. Whenever they shower, they seem to have a habit of going to the restroom in that connection as well. And they truly think that people use actually more toilet paper per household member during this quarantine? Can you
I believe it's for
believe
toilet
that
paper, and
actually
when we
habits
get
are
to, we can
being
talk about that now
affected
or
that
later
way?
if you want.
The same apparently true for
The
toothpaste?
reason that toilet paper use is going up is simply because the biological needs now all have to be addressed at the home level. And a lot of that was being dealt with out of the home. So on a per capita basis, everybody's domestic retail toilet paper use has gone up, absolutely. I can't explain shampoo or toilet paper and toothpaste, though, with the one exception, which is that there's probably a subsegment of folks, I would guess more educated, who are having what I was an anthropologist would call a purity panic attack. And this is common in a disease situation, and it's been documented before, right? So there's going to be a desire to clean the body, clean the hair, clean the mouth, which is purely, it's magical thinking. It's not rational, but it makes sense that there'd be a little bit more. I just don't think that, I find it hard to believe that people are tripling their toothpaste use the way that I could get somebody to triple their Pepsi use by just tripling the caseload in their house. So that's all I'm saying.
Right, right. It's going to be interesting to look back at this, after the fact and see what has happened. You are talking some of these habits here in this slide, talking about inelastic demand driven by behaviors, etc.
Yeah, I think the
You're
challenge is
also
that
talking about pack sizes, which is very tactical, if you like, but can become strategic in times like COVID. Can you explain that a little bit?
And built to suit the supply chain needs of large manufacturers. And I think when there's a steady rate of, I think a super steady, not very elastic consumption rate normally in categories like toilet paper, shampoo, a lot of personal care items that are ritualistically used, habitually used only once a day or maybe twice a day at most. So there aren't seasonal demands, fluctuations. You have these tendency to sell massive amounts of product to people at once, in large bursts. And that's the toilet paper, bar, soap kind of situation. And though, we might have some people who are, any one of those categories that was selling huge, what I call multi-serve unit packs, like 17 rolls of toilet paper. Anytime you have a category where the out-of-home use of that category is now moved in the home, you will get an elevated use, right? And that's what we're seeing in toilet paper. So people in the media, people made fun of toilet paper hoarding as if it was sort of irrational, and actually it's quite rational for people to have gone out and bought more because they are absolutely using more, and they will till they get back into the out-of-home environments all day long. I think in the shower it's a little less clear. I think it has more to do with your views of purity and your fear over the disease more than anything else, because people are definitely, people who are into fitness are definitely probably using more personal care items and showering more than once a day at home. But the average American, I would have to assume, is not actually doing a lot of fitness right now.
Interesting.
Yes, I know.
I mean, interestingly, we have some participants here commenting, and obviously this is not statistically significant data, but commenting that they find themselves brushing their teeth more often, period, not just depending on location, but brushing their teeth. I guess you have more time on your hand, or maybe you feel more guilty about your health now, and you've got the time to actually do something like brush your teeth or take that extra shower. We will see. You talked several times about categories, and you put together some nice slides on specific categories.
This particular slide, just before we get into that.
In these slides here. Do you want to talk about those for a second?
So I think this is IRI data. So now that we have like 6 weeks, the the curve that I showed you before, where you have this initial surge and then you have some kind of a reduction. Shampoo is one of the worst. And I think my best explanation is that people overpurchased what is really a habitually used category. And I know there are people in the comment box who probably are into fitness, so they're now working out more from home, and they are taking that second shower at home. But I think the data would suggest in the aggregate that that's not a nationwide phenomenon, that's a niche phenomenon. For most Americans, shower use is very habitual. It's once a day. We are fairly heavy showerers in the United States compared to a global norm, by the way, at once a day. But it's a very inelastic usage rate, and the behavior culturally, it's not, unless you get involved in a lifestyle activity that makes you sweaty. What will be interesting to see, though, is as the country gets hotter, whether or not it'll go back up, stabilize a little bit. But it's very clear that people bought too much. Because it's actually getting worse in the last week that we measured. So we'll see what happens. If we go to toilet paper,
Sure.
yeah, I mean this surge was the worst or the best, depending on how you want to look at it. And you know, part of it was that if you think about the psychology of hoarding, I think it made actually a lot of sense for people to say, oh my God, I'm not going to be going to the bathroom out of home anymore. I need this now. I need a lot of it. And what if we run out? The problem is that the way it's sold, it almost was the whole category set itself up for a giant supply chain nightmare because it's sold in mass quantity. And it doesn't take the consumer in a state of mild fear or moderate fear about availability to just take 2 of the 18 packs, which is exactly what they did, or 3, or 4. So, you know, people were doing that, and that's how you get that massive spike in the week of March 15th. Again, you know, the use is very habitual here. I think in a lot of these categories that are used household-wide, or they're highly attuned to personal preference, like shampoo, the brand switching has always been a big pain. It takes a lot of money, much less than in soft drinks. But the consumption is generally inelastic until you force everybody back into the home, like I said. If we go to pizza, here we have, I think, I'm calling it the COVID-19 winter because if you look at it, it's very different.
What about pizza then?
The curves you just saw. Yes, it had that 2-week surge like everyone did, but then, you know, the reduction after that was not nearly as dramatic. And what the sort of steady state week over week yearly sales plateau, the elevated tsunami wave essentially, is 50% over last year. And that, you know, in CPG, that is just, honestly, that's crazy. So what's going on here, I think, is you have a category which it's almost was set up for this kind of stay-at-home situation. For one thing, it's easily stored for a year, right? So you don't have to worry too much about your consumption rate. You can buy 4 or 5 on deal and just stuff them in your freezer. Americans have big freezers now. A lot of households have multiple freezers because I've been in them. So it's actually easier than ever to stuff. No, and that's what happened on those 2 weeks, right? People were buying probably twice as much frozen peach as they normally would have. I think a lot of this was families with children because they are the #1 heavy user in this category. Everybody at Nestle knows that. But the other thing is that it's a great product because it's convenient. It's an all-American category. It's the #2 dinner item in America, I think, after burgers. So everybody likes pizza. It also has this ability to play on almost every kind of occasion you could imagine, from the personal, you know, some people eat it habitually, you know, on Fridays or Tuesday. Some people, it's like a go-to family dinner item, but it's also completely impulsive. I mean, they're single men, I used to be one of these guys, will just open their freezer with nothing else to do, see the pizza box and immediately put it in the oven and eat it. I mean, to them, it's almost like a candy bar. I've seen that behavior. So there's a magical power to this particular category, which is cultural. just seeing the box causes people to want to have it. So if you can get 6 boxes in the house, there's a soft drink impulsivity to it where people will just start eating it. Also, despite the fact that we have time to cook, I'm skeptical that people actually want to really cook versus heat stuff up. And the reason for that is, especially the first 6 weeks, we've been very stressed out. So I think the idea that people want to do some complicated meal. Years ago when I did ethnography in homes about like busy moms who were trying to feed kids, I was shocked at how many shortcuts they were willing to take. And when I asked them, when I probed for why they wanted to do a shortcut like frozen pizza, when you do the interview carefully, you find out that it isn't about the effort so much. It isn't about the time. It's about the cognitive and emotional effort of putting a recipe together and using 6 pans. Like on some days, it's just too much. And I think we all relate to that. The other thing about pizza, which is perfect, is as I say here, you can eat it cold. You can eat it as a leftover. There's so many reasons why it's going to continue to be consumed at very elevated levels while people are trapped at home. So I think it's like a perfect category for cultural reasons. Yeah.
There's an interesting participant question here around whether we think that packaging will change, and that there's already lots of discussions around going into single use, going into singly packed items to avoid reuse, I guess, to avoid reheating, to avoid sharing, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think
I have 2 initial comments.
this crisis will have a longer-term impact
sharing
on the type of packaging formats we're going to see?
Right, in our society creates, unless you have a COVID-19 diagnosee in the home, I don't think that's a real concern. I think the average household that doesn't have a diagnosis, at this point in the situation, doesn't believe that there's any transmissibility going on inside the home. I don't think they're behaving that way. I could be totally wrong, but my sense is that people feel like their family bubble is like a magical protective bubble, right? Or their household bubble, whether it's their girlfriend or their family or whatever, whoever's in that house. I think it changes when you have a COVID-19 diagnosee, but that's very rare. So I'm not sure that that's going to be the driver. What I think might be the driver for packaging rebellion, so to speak, will be on the side of those who were already predisposed to reduce packaging use or to at least ethically improve it. Because they're literally, I mean, if you step back and look at how much crap you've been taking to your recycling bin and trash in the last 6 weeks, I mean, it's much higher than it was before this, because you're consuming all your food at home. I think people have there's a heightened awareness to how much packaging people are consuming. And that might cause people to want to buy multi-serve more. But, I think if anything, the people who are interested in ethical packaging, less plastic, things like that, they're going to be more ratcheted up about that and more ticked off about it. So I think that trend may actually accelerate coming out of this. And I know there are several large companies that are on that, and I think there's a potential for a soda company or a beverage company to take a huge leadership win out of this if they can accelerate something like a compostable bottle, like fast. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Right. Let's stick with organic, natural, sustainable for a second. It was a huge trend coming in, and I see mixed signals now. On the one hand, we have some participants commenting that they are working out more. In my village, certainly, I see a lot more people on the streets walking around, visibly appreciating nature, taking pictures, going out on their bikes, and you could assume that maybe there's going to be a heightened awareness of the importance of nature, the environment, preserving it. On the other hand, I also see the single-use packaging issue literally in the streets. A lot of packaging throwaway, a lot of latex gloves and face masks lying around everywhere, hanging in the bushes. And it seems like people are throwing away all the concerns about climate change or whatever and say, we have bigger fish to fry. We have a crisis at hand. Do you see us moving one way or another, or is it going to flip back to more or less where the sentiment was in a couple of months from now?
So I follow a crude sociological set of theories around this. I can't prove them with current data because it's super hard to collect, but I'll throw it out there for people to think about. And one is that it has been studied pretty rigorously that when people get in a state of, if people are forced, a sort of legally or otherwise socially pressured to stay inside due to disease, or in the more tragic case of a domestic civil war like Syria or Yugoslavia in the 90s, people, they make these large changes of habit, and they become very focused on the family. They become hyper-focused on family, on taking care of themselves, on basic needs, but also I think they become very heightened to any sense of alienation that they have, right? And I think America has a lot of that. So I think people are kind of in a, I'm not sure that there's a lot of attention or emotional energy to aspire to those spiritual and lofty heights. And I will say in CPG, what I've noticed over the years, even before this, is that the farther removed from the consumption experience a certain sort of promised outcome is, like saving the planet by having this bottle, when in reality I drink soda for other reasons, primarily, that are well documented. Trying to layer on this spiritual motive, essentially, which is not one that the consumer perceives directly, right? Like if I switch to compostable plastic bottles, I don't directly see I don't see anything change in my life. It doesn't change anything. So you have to be in a social situation where you're very comfortable. You're not worried about survival. You're certainly not worried about disease infection coming in your door randomly. So I don't think we're in the situation for that. I think it will come back, JP. I think it will snap back as people get more confident. I think, however, it's still a great time for companies to take leadership on that issue. Because if they do it now, then they will capture a lot of attention as people come back to that theme. I just think we're temporarily not that interested right now. So I think what you're seeing makes total sense to me.
Got you. I just want to note for everyone that if you have issues with video, audio, or other, you are not alone. But I understand that most people are able to follow the audio. Unfortunately, for example, you might have to pass on my beautiful face because for some reason I blacked out. But nothing is lost there. The substance is there. And coming back to the substance, James, a lot of consumption right now also of old staples that were under a lot of pressure. I'm talking Heinz baked beans. I'm talking about mac and cheese. I'm talking about Campbell's soups that literally were written off. I mean, you're a food expert, right? They were assaulted left, right, and center. Orange juice was declared dead. And now we find it heartwarming to go back to those products that we used when we were a child, at least if you're a baby boomer or maybe even a millennial. Do you think it's going to last, or once we're over that hump, we go right back to kale chips?
So I have a two-pronged answer. The kale chip crowd, they haven't changed their behavior, I don't think. I know those people really well. They're super ideological. They're super committed. They will bust. They have been, I know, because I have friends who are like that. They have busted their ass to maintain all of that, and they're doing fine. Like their quality of food hasn't changed at all. I think there's this larger group of people that's more interesting in the middle class who episodically traded up to things, and I think that trade up has been snuffed out due to cash flow issues and unemployment and fear. But on the nostalgic food issue, I do think that's a Pan-American thing, and I think that's why you're seeing it across demographic groups, where in these kinds of situations, it's almost like a mass societal version of a bad day at work. I know that sounds ridiculous, but let's just follow it. It's like a bad day of work, and I've studied this because I've done so many interviews with consumers. Emotional eating is a mass societal phenomena for anybody who's had a shitty day at work. Right? They will come home and they will have a set of categories that they go to make themselves feel better. And the most common one is alcohol, but there are also food categories as well. So that we can all relate to. I think we're seeing a society version of that going on. And when people do engage in that kind of emotional eating, it's fascinating. It's often an iconic snack or beverage brand that they grew up eating as a kid, even if it's not a normative one, right? So that will explain why, formerly low-growth comfort foods, brands that weren't doing really well now suddenly have a spike. But I don't believe that's going to continue. I don't.
Got you.
I wouldn't.
I do want to get to the startup brands.
Yep.
I do want to get to the startup brands because you've written a whole book about how to, I quote, the book is entitled Ramping Your Brand, how to start up, and kind of subtitle, Write the Killer CPG Growth Curve for Startups. We actually, and this is a little plug, will have a off-the-shelf podcast on that subject. So just look it up at the conference board /podcast. And we're going to get to this in a second. But there are some interesting questions and comments by participants here around, JP, where have you seen those gloves lying around? Others saying, I've heard about it. Next one saying, I live in the Bronx. I see a lot of them. I live in a little bit further up north from New York in Westchester County. The question that triggers in my mind, James, is what about differences geographically and maybe income level and neighborhood differences when it comes to these consumption patterns? Do you see some shifts there versus pre, or no, the food desert will remain in certain areas of the country, and the fancy foods are going to be rather urban and among higher earners? Any trends you see shifting triggered by this crisis?
I don't have any visibility into that. I don't know. Sorry.
Got you.
Yeah.
Fair answer. So let's get to your second pferd, as we say here in New York. You have written this book about the startups, and you're talking to them about how to design to command a premium, because lots of these startup items, not only in food, but just think of the Pelotons and so on of this world, are premium priced,
right,
and how to scale and get big over time. Are they being disrupted right now? How, and is it in a good way or bad way, the startups?
Well, believe it or not, it depends how tiny they are. One thing that I think folks who are used to studying the big public firms and the established brands don't realize is that the vast majority of brands that you'll see in any Nielsen or IRI data set in any category, the vast majority of them are selling less than $5 million out of the register a year, 80%. So 80% of the brands for sale in America, online or in retail, are just tiny little players. And I think in that crucial, delicate phase, the biggest problem right now is staying on the shelf, getting reorders to actually happen through the distribution pipes, because those brands rely on third-party distribution to a large extent. So they have actually route to market problems. But they also have a second set of problems, which is they haven't been around long enough to generate outsized awareness in local markets where they're for sale usually. So they have a trial problem. And one of the things that my book talks about at length is that the cruel reality of being a almost zero awareness trademark with an innovative product trying to compete on the same shelf as Annie's, which is an established premium brand, and Kraft mac and cheese next to it, right? That would be like the nightmare scenario. And those are the brands that are really struggling this year, and it's really more about survival mode. The funny thing, though, is that I'm hearing from my clients who are in the 8-figure range, so 10 to $75 million trailing sales. These are the up-and-coming next mid-market brands. They're depending on whether they're in one of these auspicious categories. That spike in elevated sales, JP, can actually accelerate their own growth. So I think, a massive tailwind out of this. I suspect Spindrift is one of them. Daily Harvest is a frozen, direct, nutritious meal convenience brand. I've been telling my clients to buy cable TV ads as fast as they can when they're in that range, because this is a great time to get attention for at-home categories that service.
I work with food kit delivery brands. Think of Blue Apron and Marley and Spoon and Martha, Marley and Spoon, and so on. And frankly, they weren't really hot before COVID. They were kind of plateauing or in decline, depending on which brand you talk about. Now they're seeing a 2 to 4x rise in orders. Permanent or temporary?
That's a tough question. My best guess is that a percentage of those new triers will stick with it for the same reason that other people stuck with the brand. It's still going to be a minority of the trying base, but it's really going to depend on how complex the recipe production is, because once people literally have more time, and they actually have more social excuse to spend more time cooking because their boss has a little less control over their actual time. I mean, that's just true, right? So that has liberated people to spend 45 minutes on dinner if they want to. That's going to all go away once people get back out of the house into some of those normal rhythms. So in the continuum of meal kits, it's going to be the much easier 15 to 20-minute recipes that are going to, I think, those brands are going to do much better than, say, Plated or Blue Apron, which I've used them both, and they're pretty time-consuming. So that has a much lower addressable market, I think.
Right. Also, in the context of startups and even the forgotten categories, there are these surprising developments right now. Some of them are predictable, like, okay, more hand sanitizer sales. That makes sense. Purell is on fire. That's no miracle, right? Others you understand after thinking about it for a minute, like, even old TV series are being gobbled up and are getting huge income all of a sudden again. Yes, it makes us feel good. We look at old TV series, and by the way, even Netflix runs out of content, so that also makes sense. But bread making and bread makers, going through the roof, that takes a bit of a stretch of imagination, particularly if you wanted to predict it. What can forgotten categories or startups do to try and create such a trend for themselves, for their category?
So I don't have high hopes for baking from scratch long term after this is over. That's my. I know American society pretty well, and I don't think it's going to create a massive surge in complex baking at home, because we abandoned that for a reason structurally. I think if you have a category, however, that's like baked beans, like, for example, I have a client who's got a baked bean startup, and his sales have not only surged, but they're still selling at a massively elevated level, in part because it's a comfort food that has been forgotten, but also it tastes good. Everybody knows what it's going to taste like, but also we have a evolving meat shortage, right? And there's one thing I learned studying people so you've got an out-of-stock issue that can be solved with an all-American protein alternative, and that is beans. It's not Beyond Meat, not yet, but it's beans. So you can, I think someone in those kinds of situations, if you have a category that was sort of forgotten, that's an easy substitute, then you should be marketing right now. You actually should be marketing if you have the cash. Because I think that you might actually wind up with a permanent elevated sales rate afterwards. So you might get some long-term structural growth out of this thing. Go ahead.
What about category? Sorry. What about category reinvention in terms of the go-to-market model? So what I mean by that is some small retailers are getting pushed into innovating their go-to-market model, and we hear about restaurants all of a sudden doing packaged foods. We hear about, drive-by services of whatever kind. I just saw my neighbor now has a drive-by hairdresser even. Is there an opportunity, and what do you see as opportunities for people to reinvent the delivery, the business model, or business models that have been trying to now gain traction? We talked about food kits earlier. You weren't too hopeful about those sticking around. Do you see other business model reinventions that might get great trial and a chance to stick?
I think alcohol delivery, last mile alcohol delivery, I think if they play their cards right, could, I don't know that they are, by the way. I think that they could do quite well. I think long-term out of this. The way I look at it as a social scientist is that if you have a offering, which is, it's new, it's either like alcohol delivery, like Drizzly, it's the route to market in a specific category, or it's a specific segment within a category. If that innovation is highly adapted to home consumption, right? It doesn't matter. This is a perfect time to get trial in a sense, because you've got a massive amount of captive people at home. There's a serious boredom issue going on, right? So if you can get your marketing content in there to get them aware, to build awareness at least, if not trial, and direct and sell online, you should actually be able to get a leg up on your post-COVID sales growth permanently. Because as an at-home innovation, you aren't exposed to out-of-home behavior as a small business, if that makes sense, because you're too small. I mean, when you're Pepsi, the shutdown of out-of-home has been a real financial problem, and it will be for quite a while. But that's a mature company issue. If you're a small $30 million company or startup or something, you don't care about that giant shift in behavior. You can grow right through that as it happens above your head. Does that make sense?
Right. I mean, if I look at the chart that we still got up here, impulsive means that you need to be present where people have those impulses, right? So at the supermarket, etc. And that's a tough thing to do unless you're the big kid. Or, impulsive, you go to the ballpark and you have the concession stands there, etc. It seems to me that trying to become ritualistic is kind of nirvana.
Well, that's what pizza's doing.
Do you have examples of brands that have succeeded to become ritualistic? Or do brands have to watch for rituals being created? So, for example, I could imagine that family dinners have a renaissance here, have a resurgence, and there's a whole bunch of brands that could cram into that. Can brands help the formation of rituals, or that's human?
I believe that any brand can insert itself into existing ritual patterns, and that's something I advise clients who are in the startup world. Once you're 8 figures, even 7 figures, I advise most of my clients they've got to start inserting themselves into, for marketing and awareness building reasons, into out-of-home and at-home rituals. The problem is none of those are happening right now. I'm less bullish, JP, long-term about the family dinner. I think we have a renaissance right now, but I think the family is not a priority in American society. The structure of our work and culture has never prioritized it. You're from Germany. You can sense the difference, I'm sure. We don't care. So the family focus, I think, will fade. Again, I mean, I know it's depressing, but that's what I believe will happen. What's much more important, I think, for brand building is once we get back to those group socialization activities is making sure your brand is there. And that's an opportunity for anybody out there.
Right. Before we close, and unfortunately time is running out, time goes fast when you're having fun, as they say in Germany. I wanted to circle back actually to your time in India as an anthropologist, and I wondered, do you see some opportunities for American CPG companies abroad somehow pushed by this crisis? Could it be that there are changes that favor what American CPG companies have to offer, or can you not see any distinct advantages here?
You know, I don't have my pulse on what right now what may have changed in terms of strategic outlook or opportunity. I think it's pretty similar to what it was. You know, the large emerging markets, underdeveloped markets, quote unquote, like India, have been rapidly accelerating their consumption of branded foreign snacks and beverages, and I think that will continue. I don't see this disrupting that at all, per se. I think, you know, but I'm less aware of how much of that consumption is impulse out of the home in those markets than it is in the United States. So it really depends. It depends on that.
Gotcha. Here's another interesting philosophical discussion going on among participants, which is, aren't those staples that we go back to, the mac and cheeses and the other packaged goods, that were these big celebrated achievements after World War II that we all marveled over, aren't they at the same time the causes for a lot of our disease? They say that things like diabetes or being overweight actually might make us more susceptible to contracting COVID-19. Do you see, again, do you see that as a major concern, or do you say, no, in this place here in the U.S., people seem to be indifferent, or do you see something accelerating in terms of health trends
I think the health,
when it comes to food?
The trend of awareness about diet's impact on comorbidities related to obesity is a very long-term structural trend. We know it's going. I think it's somewhat muted, if not on pause, in a lot of households in terms of the growth of that trend. But I do see that coming back after this is over, but not right now. I think people have bigger issues. The reality is that if you look at, and I'm embarrassed to say that I have looked at this data. If you look at NHANES longitudinal data and calorie intake in the United States, the reason America is getting obese has had to do with per capita, maybe, 100 calories to 150 excess calories a day. And when you eat that for 20, 30 years, you'll become obese, if that makes sense. That's really what's been going on in this country. We don't have a society that's making people obese in 12 months. I mean, there are people who go through that process, but that's pretty rare. So I think the awareness of those issues will return when people have some emotional energy to deal with that. But you're talking about self-restraint, right? The positive reaction to that awareness is to start to really, stay away from carbs, stay away from high sugar. People are not in a mood of self-restraint right now. They're just trying to get through the day.
So let me wrap this up and make this a positive note, saying that the COVID crisis, as we have seen throughout, presents us with the opportunity to kind of reflect on what we're doing, how we're living, how we're acting, what we're choosing. And that's for consumers as well as for manufacturers, and can be an opportunity. I think there's this saying about, there's nothing worse than wasting a crisis. That's a quote in a different context, but can be applied to this. So with that, James, first of all, I want to thank you a lot for joining us under these circumstances, including through the technical difficulties, but I think everyone got the conversation because people hang in and they commented. Second, I want to make everyone aware that there is another virtual event coming up on May 20th that is actually related to this discussion. It's about supply chain visibility, traceability, transparency. So for those who want to dive into even further detail, you are welcome. In general, you can find plenty of podcasts on our influencers and off-the-shelf podcasts, including one with James coming up very shortly. Probably we'll post it in a week from now about the book we were referencing called Ramping Your Brand. So check us out. We've even kind of bundled everything to do with COVID and coronavirus and how it affects brands, business, communication, financing, and finances under one header on the website. So just click through to that link. You'll find it also in the webcast notes. And with that, I want to say thank you again. And
thank you.